The morning sun cast long shadows across Willowbrook Estates as David Thompson sat in his kitchen staring at the letter that had arrived 3 days after his wife's funeral. The crisp white envelope bore the seal of the Willowbrook Homeowners Association, and inside was a notice that would change everything. $500. That was the fine they were imposing on him for allegedly violating community standards during his period of mourning. David's hands trembled as he read the official language: failure to maintain lawn standards, unauthorized gathering exceeding permitted capacity, proper disposal of floral arrangements. Each infraction carried its own penalty, but the total came to exactly $500, the same amount he had spent on Martha's favorite roses for her memorial service in their backyard garden. 437 years Martha had been his anchor. They had moved to Willowbrook Estates 15 years ago when David's construction business had finally taken off. The community had seemed perfect then, with its tree-lined streets, manicured common areas, the beautiful man-made lake at its center. Martha had loved sitting by that lake in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and crimson. The HOA had been reasonable in those early days. The fees were modest, and the rules seemed designed to preserve the beauty that had drawn them here. But over the years, new board members had been elected, and with them came increasingly rigid enforcement of an ever-growing list of regulations. What had once been a community had slowly transformed into something that felt more like a prison with perfectly trimmed hedges. David remembered the day Martha first fell ill. It had started with small things, forgetting where she put her keys, struggling to remember the names of neighbors they had known for years. The diagnosis had come like a thunderbolt. Early onset dementia. The doctors said they caught it relatively early, but the prognosis was clear. Martha would gradually slip away from him, piece by piece, until only her body remained. The next 5 years had been a slow agony of watching the woman he loved disappear. Martha had good days and bad days, but the bad days became more frequent. David had taken early retirement to care for her full-time. His construction business, which he had built from nothing, was sold to his longtime foreman. All that mattered was spending whatever time they had left together. During those difficult years, the HOA had shown no compassion. When David's lawn developed brown patches because he was too exhausted from caring for Martha to maintain it properly, they fined him. When he hired a less expensive lawn service that didn't meet their exacting standards, they fined him again. When Martha in her confusion had painted their front door a cheerful yellow because it reminded her of sunflowers, they demanded he change it back to an approved color within 48 hours. Each fine, each demand, each cold bureaucratic letter had felt like a slap in the face. But David had endured it all because Martha loved their home. On her good days, she would sit in the garden they had planted together and smile at the roses she could no longer remember planting. The house held their memories, their life together, and David would not let the HOA drive them away. The funeral had been small. Martha had outlived most of her family, and David's relatives were scattered across the country, but their neighbors had come. People who had watched Martha tend her garden for 15 years, who had seen her gentle smile and kind heart. They had gathered in David's backyard, where Martha had spent her final month sitting in the shade of the oak tree they had planted on their first anniversary. David had thought the service was beautiful, simple and dignified, just as Martha would have wanted. The roses from her garden had provided the only decoration, their fragrance filling the air as friends and neighbors shared memories of a woman who had touched their lives in quiet ways. There had been perhaps 30 people there, including the pastor and the funeral director. Well within the HOA's stated limits for gatherings, but apparently the HOA board had seen things differently. The letter cited multiple violations. The gathering had been reported as exceeding capacity limits, though David knew he had checked the community guidelines and was well within the allowed number. The lawn had been deemed substandard, though David had hired a service to mow it the day before the funeral. Most insulting of all, they claimed the floral arrangements had been improperly disposed of, when in fact, David had carefully composted the flowers in the designated area behind his garage. $500 for grieving his wife, for saying goodbye to the woman who had been his world for nearly 4 decades. David felt something cold and hard settle in his chest as he read the letter again. The HOA had crossed a line, and they had no idea what they had just unleashed. David Thompson was not a man to be underestimated. His construction business had not succeeded by accident. He had built it through careful planning, shrewd negotiations, and an understanding of how systems worked, and more importantly, how they could be manipulated. He had sold the business, but he had not sold his knowledge, his connections, or his considerable accumulated wealth. The first thing David did was research. He spent the next week poring over HOA documents, community bylaws, and property records. What he discovered was fascinating. The Willowbrook Estates HOA was more vulnerable than they realized, and their greatest asset is also their greatest weakness. The lake that formed the centerpiece of the community was not actually owned by the HOA. It sat on a separate parcel that had been leased to the community by its original developer. The lease had been transferred several times over the years and was currently held by a small property management company based in the state capital. More importantly, the lease was set to expire in 18 months and contained a clause allowing for early termination under certain circumstances. David smiled for the first time since Martha's death as he made his first phone call. By the end of the week, he had established contact with the property management company and learned that they were indeed interested in selling the lake property. The asking price was substantial but well within David's means, especially after the sale of his business. More importantly, they were motivated. Sellers facing their own financial pressures, but buying the lake was only the first step in David's plan. The real leverage came from understanding the legal structure of the HOA itself. The community covenants that governed Willowbrook Estates contained specific language about access to common areas and amenities. The lake was mentioned prominently in the marketing materials and covenants as one of the primary benefits of living in the community. If the lake were to become unavailable, the property values in Willowbrook Estates would plummet. More than that, David discovered that several of the current HOA board members had recently refinanced their homes based on inflated property values that assumed continued access to the lake. Without the lake, their mortgages would be underwater, and they would face significant financial hardship. David began making discreet inquiries about other properties in the area. There were several undeveloped parcels adjacent to Willowbrook Estates that could potentially be purchased and developed. With his construction background, David knew exactly what would most horrify the current residents. Low-income housing. A trailer park. Commercial development. The possibilities were endless and all perfectly legal. The beauty of David's plan was its simplicity. He was not trying to destroy the HOA through lawsuits or legal challenges. He was simply going to remove their most valuable asset and then give them a choice. Drop their ridiculous fees and regulations or watch their property values collapse as he surrounded their pristine community with everything they had spent years trying to keep out. 3 months after receiving the fine, David made his first move. He submitted an application to attend the next HOA board meeting as a concerned homeowner. The request was granted, though he could sense the wariness in the response. The board knew they had angered him, but they had no idea what was coming. The board meeting was held in the community center, a building that overlooked the lake. David arrived early and took a seat in the back row, watched as the 5 board members took their places at the front table. There was Margaret Wilson, the board president, a retired teacher who had moved to Willowbrook 3 years ago and immediately began campaigning for stricter rules. Beside her sat Tom Bradley, the treasurer, a middle manager at an insurance company, who seemed to take genuine pleasure in calculating fines and fees. The other board members were Linda Chen, the secretary Patricia Murphy, who handled architectural reviews, and Robert Davis, who oversaw landscaping standards. David knew all of their names, their occupations, and most importantly, their financial situations. He had done his homework. The meeting began with routine business. Minutes from the previous meeting were approved. The treasurer's report was presented, showing the HOA's healthy bank balance, swollen with fines and fees collected from residents. Then came the enforcement report, where Tom Bradley read through a list of violations issued in the past month. David's name was mentioned. The $500 fine had been paid, he was told, though the board noted that it had taken several follow-up notices to secure payment. This was a lie. David had paid the fine within the required time frame, but he said nothing. He was gathering information, watching how they operated, learning their patterns. When the time came for homeowner comments, David stood and walked to the front of the room. He could feel the tension in the air as the board members recognized him. Margaret Wilson's smile was thin and cold as she acknowledged him. David kept his remarks brief and polite. He expressed his disappointment with how the HOA had handled his wife's funeral and memorial service. He noted that the fine seemed excessive and poorly justified. He suggested that perhaps the board might consider a more compassionate approach to enforcement, especially during difficult times in residents' lives. The response was exactly what David had expected. Margaret Wilson offered her condolences, but explained that rules were rules. The community standards existed for everyone's benefit, and exceptions could not be made no matter how sympathetic the circumstances. Tom Bradley added that the fines had been carefully calculated based on documented violations and were entirely appropriate. David nodded politely and thanked the board for their time. He made no threats, issued no warnings, gave no hint of what was coming. He simply collected his papers and left the meeting. But as he walked past the large windows overlooking the lake, he allowed himself a small smile. Soon, very soon, that view would no longer be available to the residents of Willowbrook Estates. The next morning, David's lawyer called the property management company that owned the lake. The negotiation was swift and professional. David offered 20% above the asking price in exchange for a quick closing and certain modifications to the property deed. Within 2 weeks, the sale was complete, and David Thompson became the sole owner of the 12-gur lake that formed the heart of Willowbrook Estates. David's next step was to visit the county planning office. As a former developer, he knew the system well and had maintained relationships with key personnel over the years. He filed the necessary paperwork to terminate the lake access lease with the HOA, citing new development plans for the property. Under the terms of the original lease, this was entirely legal and required only 90 days' notice. The letter David sent to the HOA board was a masterpiece of legal precision. Written by his attorney, it explained that the lake property had been sold to a private development company, Thompson Holdings LLC, which David had created for this purpose. The letter noted that the access lease would be terminated in 90 days, at which point all HOA activities on the lake property would need to cease. The letter also mentioned that Thompson Holdings was in the early stages of planning a major development project on the lake property. While details were still being finalized, the project would likely include multifamily housing, commercial spaces, and recreational facilities designed to serve a broader regional market rather than the exclusive Willowbrook Estates community. David hand-delivered copies of the letter to each board member's home on a Saturday morning. He wanted to see their faces as they read it, wanted to watch the realization dawn that their carefully controlled world was about to change dramatically. Margaret Wilson's reaction was exactly what David had hoped for. She opened her door still, in her bathrobe, and read the letter while he waited. The color drained from her face as she processed the implications. She looked up at David with a mixture of shock and fury, but before she could speak, he simply tipped his hat politely and walked away. By Monday morning, David's phone was ringing constantly. The HOA board wanted to meet with him urgently. They wanted to negotiate to find a solution to work something out. David let the calls go to voicemail. He was not ready to negotiate. Not yet. Instead, David spent the week meeting with architects and contractors. Not because he actually intended to develop the lake property, but because he wanted the word to spread throughout the construction community. Soon, every tradesman and supplier in the region would know that a major development was planned for the Willowbrook area. Property values in the surrounding areas would begin to rise in anticipation, while values within Willowbrook Estates would start to fall as word spread about the loss of lake access. The HOA board's desperation became more apparent with each passing day. They held an emergency board meeting and then an emergency community meeting. Residents were panicking as they realized what the loss of the lake would mean to their property values. Some were already talking about selling and moving elsewhere. David watched it all unfold with grim satisfaction. These were the same people who had shown no mercy when he was caring for his dying wife. The same people who had fined him for grieving. Now, they were getting a taste of what it felt like to be powerless to watch something precious slip away. 2 weeks after delivering his letter, David finally agreed to meet with the HOA board. The meeting was held in Margaret Wilson's living room, and the atmosphere was tense. The 5 board members sat across from David like defendants awaiting sentencing. Margaret Wilson spoke first, trying to maintain her authoritative demeanor despite the circumstances. She explained that the board was willing to work with David to find a mutually beneficial solution. Perhaps the HOA could increase their lease payments for the lake access. Maybe they could offer David a position on the board, or waive his HOA fees permanently. David listened politely to their increasingly desperate offers. When they finished, he leaned back in his chair and smiled. Then he told them exactly what it would take for him to reconsider his development plans. First, the $500 fine imposed on him for his wife's funeral would be refunded along with a written apology from the board. Second, the HOA's enforcement policies would be completely overhauled with a focus on reasonableness and compassion rather than rigid rule following. Third, the current board would resign immediately, and new elections would be held with David having approval rights over candidates. The demands were harsh, but not unreasonable considering what the board had put David through. However, David was not finished. He also wanted the HOA to establish a community garden in Martha's memory on a prime piece of common land near the lake. The garden would be maintained by volunteers and would be a place where residents could grow flowers and vegetables without fear of violating landscaping codes. Margaret Wilson's face was red with anger as David outlined his terms. She started to object, but Tom Bradley cut her off. The treasurer had clearly done the math and realized that agreeing to David's demands was far preferable to watching their property values collapse. One by one, the other board members reluctantly nodded their agreement, but David was still not finished. He had one more surprise for the board members who had made his life miserable during Martha's illness. He pulled out a thick folder and placed it on Margaret Wilson's coffee table. Inside the folder were detailed financial records for each board member. David's private investigator had been thorough. Margaret Wilson had recently taken out a substantial home equity loan to fund her retirement lifestyle. Tom Bradley was overextended on credit cards and facing potential bankruptcy. Each board member had financial vulnerabilities that would be exposed if property values in Willowbrook Estates declined significantly. David explained calmly that these financial pressures were not his concern, but they did provide additional motivation for the board to accept his terms. If they refused his offer and forced him to proceed with development, not only would they lose their lake access, but their personal financial situations would become much more precarious. The message was clear. David held all the cards, and the board had no choice but to accept his terms or face financial ruin. The meeting ended with reluctant agreement from all 5 board members, though David could see the hatred in their eyes. Within a week, the HOA had issued a formal apology for the fine imposed after Martha's funeral. The $500 was refunded along with interest. The board announced their resignations, citing personal reasons, and called for new elections. The enforcement policies were suspended pending a complete review and revision, but David's revenge was not complete. He had learned too much about how the HOA operated and the damage they had done to other residents over the years. The Thompson Holdings development project would proceed, but not as originally threatened. Instead of low-income housing or commercial development, David announced plans for a memorial park and community center. The lake would remain accessible to Willowbrook residents, but would also be open to the broader community. There would be walking trails, picnic areas, and educational programs about local wildlife and environmental conservation. The memorial park would be dedicated to Martha Thompson and would feature the community garden David had demanded, along with a small amphitheater for outdoor concerts and events. The entire project would be funded by David's Foundation and would be a lasting tribute to his wife's memory. The announcement sent shockwaves through Willowbrook Estates. The former board members were furious, but powerless to stop it. The residents were divided between those who appreciated David's vision, and those who were horrified at the prospect of outsiders using their previously exclusive amenities. David didn't care about the complaints. He had achieved his primary objectives. HOA's power had been broken, and their cruel enforcement policies had been ended. The community would remain beautiful, but it would no longer be a prison for its residents. The new board elections were held 6 months later. David did not run for a position himself, but he carefully vetted the candidates. The new board was composed of reasonable people who understood that an HOA should serve its residents, rather than terrorize them. The new rules were simple and focused on genuine safety and maintenance issues, rather than petty aesthetic preferences. Construction on the Martha Thompson Memorial Park began the following spring. David was heavily involved in the planning and design, working with landscape architects to create something that would honor his wife's love of nature. While serving the broader community, the community garden was planted with Martha's favorite flowers: roses, daisies, and sunflowers that bloomed in brilliant yellow displays. As the park neared completion, David often found himself sitting by the lake in the early evening, watching the sunset paint the water gold and crimson, just as Martha had loved to do. The anger that had driven him for the past year was slowly being replaced by something else. Not exactly peace, but a sense that he had honored Martha's memory in a way that would last. The park officially opened on the anniversary of Martha's death. Hundreds of people attended, including many current and former Willowbrook residents. There were families with children, elderly couples walking hand in hand, and teenagers volunteering to help with the garden maintenance. It was exactly the kind of community gathering that the old HOA would have banned, but now it was celebrated. David gave a brief speech at the dedication ceremony. He spoke about Martha's love of gardening and her belief that beauty should be shared, rather than hoarded. He talked about the importance of community and compassion, and the dangers of letting rigid rules replace human kindness. As the ceremony concluded and people began exploring the new park facilities, David walked to the memorial bench that had been placed under Martha's favorite oak tree. The plaque read simply, "Martha Thompson, 1955 to 2023. She made everything beautiful." David sat on the bench and watched families enjoying the park that had risen from his grief and anger. The former HOA board members were all gone now. Margaret Wilson had sold her house and moved to Florida. Tom Bradley had declared bankruptcy and relocated to a smaller apartment across town. The others had similarly fled the community they had once ruled with iron fists. Their reign of petty tyranny was over, and Willowbrook Estates was finally becoming the kind of place Martha would have wanted to live. David's phone buzzed with a text from his daughter, who lived in California. She'd seen photos of the park opening on social media and wanted to tell him how proud she was of what he had accomplished. It was the first time she had said she was proud of him since Martha's death, and it meant more than all the newspaper articles praising his community vision. As the sun set over the lake, David made a decision. He would not be leaving Willowbrook Estates. This was still his home, the place where he and Martha had built their life together. But now it was also something more. It was a community where kindness mattered more than rule following, where people could grieve and celebrate without fear of punishment, where beauty was meant to be shared. The HOA still existed, but it was a different organization now. Monthly meetings were well attended and focused on genuine community improvement rather than enforcement of arbitrary regulations. The fees had been reduced and were used for practical purposes like road maintenance and snow removal rather than funding the salaries of petty bureaucrats. David served on the Architectural Review Committee, but his approach was radically different from his predecessors. When homeowners wanted to make changes to their properties, he worked with them to find solutions that preserved the community's beauty while respecting individual preferences. The yellow front door that Martha had painted was still there, and David had successfully argued that it should be protected as a historic feature. The community garden had become the heart of the new Willowbrook Estates. Residents of all ages worked together, planting, tending, and harvesting vegetables and flowers. Children learned about nature while elderly residents shared gardening wisdom accumulated over decades. It was exactly the kind of intergenerational community activity that healthy neighborhoods needed. David often worked in the garden in the early morning hours before the heat of the day set in. He had taken over Martha's rose bushes and had learned through trial and error how to keep them blooming throughout the growing season. It was slow, meditative work that helped him process his grief while creating something beautiful. The lake access issue had been permanently resolved through a complex legal arrangement that David's lawyers had crafted. The HOA now held a permanent easement for resident access, while David retained ownership and control over development around the lake. It was a solution that protected both the community's interests and David's ability to prevent future abuse. Other communities had begun reaching out to David for advice on HOA reform. His story had spread through social media and local news. Coverage inspiring residents in similar situations to challenge unreasonable board policies. David had become an unlikely advocate for homeowner rights and reasonable community governance. The irony was not lost on him. Same skills that had made him successful in construction. Careful planning, attention to detail, and understanding of complex systems had proven equally valuable in dismantling an oppressive HOA structure. But where he had once built physical structures, he was now building something more important, a community based on mutual respect and shared responsibility. 2 years after Martha's death, David hosted the first annual Memorial Garden Festival. The event celebrated the community's transformation and raised money for a scholarship fund in Martha's name. Local musicians performed in the amphitheater. Families enjoyed picnic lunches by the lake, and children participated in nature scavenger hunts through the park trails. As David watched the festivities, he realized that his grief had been transformed into something else. Not forgotten, Martha would always be with him, but channeled into creating something positive that would outlast his own lifetime. The community garden would continue blooming long after he was gone, and future generations would benefit from the precedent he had set for reasonable HOA governance. The former board members' houses had all been sold to young families who brought energy and fresh perspectives to the community. These new residents had no memory of the old regime's oppressive policies and simply assumed that Willowbrook Estates had always been a welcoming place where neighbors looked out for each other. David's own house had become a gathering place for community planning meetings and informal social events. The backyard where Martha's funeral had been held now hosted birthday parties, barbecues, and holiday celebrations. Space had been transformed from a place of sorrow into a place of joy and community connection. The lawsuit that David had always expected from the former board members never materialized. His lawyers had been careful to ensure that all actions were completely legal, and the former board's financial difficulties made lengthy litigation impractical. They had been outmaneuvered completely and could only watch from a distance as their former community thrived without them. David's construction business had been sold, but his expertise remained in demand. He consulted on community development projects throughout the region, helping other neighborhoods create spaces that served residents' needs while maintaining property values. His reputation as someone who could navigate complex regulatory environments while keeping human needs at the center had spread far beyond Willowbrook Estates. The HOA fee structure had been completely overhauled under the new board's leadership. Instead of punitive fines for minor violations, the focus shifted to education and assistance. Residents who struggled with landscaping received help from volunteers rather than penalties. Those facing financial hardship could work out payment plans rather than facing liens on their homes. David had established a hardship fund within the HOA, budget specifically to help residents facing difficult circumstances. The fund could provide temporary lawn care for families dealing with illness, emergency repairs for seniors on fixed incomes, and other forms of practical support that prevented minor problems from becoming major violations. The transformation of Willowbrook Estates had not gone unnoticed by local government officials. The city council had recognized the community as a model for effective neighborhood governance, and David had been invited to speak at conferences about community development and HOA reform. He always began these presentations with Martha's story, explaining how personal tragedy had revealed systemic problems that needed to be addressed. The memorial park had exceeded all expectations in terms of community usage. The walking trails were busy from dawn to dusk, with residents exercising their dogs and visitors from neighboring communities. The educational programs about local wildlife had attracted school groups and scout troops, creating connections between Willowbrook Estates and the broader region. The lake itself had been restored to health through David's environmental improvement initiatives. Working with local conservation groups, he had installed filtration systems to improve water quality, planted native vegetation along the shoreline, and created habitat areas for waterfowl and other wildlife. The lake that had once been merely decorative was now a thriving ecosystem. David's relationship with his grown children had improved significantly since Martha's death and his successful campaign against the HOA. They had been worried about his isolation and bitterness, but seeing him channel his energy into positive community change had reassured them about his emotional recovery. His son had moved back to the area with his own family, and his daughter visited more frequently from California. The annual HOA meetings had been transformed from tense confrontations into productive community forums. Residents felt free to voice concerns and suggestions without fear of retaliation. The new board members saw their role as facilitators rather than enforcers in meetings, often ended with social time where neighbors could catch up with each other. David had never remarried and had no intention of doing so. Martha had been his life partner, and no one could replace her. But he had found new purpose in his community work and had developed strong friendships with neighbors who shared his values. His social isolation had ended, though his grief remained a constant companion. The yellow front door that Martha had painted in her confusion had become a symbol of the community's transformation. Instead of demanding conformity, the new HOA had embraced it as a reminder that homes should reflect their owners' personalities and histories. Several other residents had since painted their doors in bright colors, and the rainbow of entrances had become one of Willowbrook Estate's most distinctive and beloved features. David's story had inspired a book written by a local journalist about HOA abuse and reform. The book had become a bestseller and had led to legislative changes in several states strengthening homeowner rights and limiting HOA powers. David had donated his share of the book's profits to organizations working on housing advocacy and community development. The community garden had expanded beyond its original boundaries as more residents became interested in growing their own food and flowers. What had started as a memorial to Martha had become a network of shared growing spaces throughout Willowbrook Estates. Children learned about nutrition and environmental stewardship, while adults shared knowledge and harvests. David's daily routine now included morning walks through the Memorial Park, followed by work in the community garden and afternoon visits to neighbors who needed assistance. He had become the unofficial community grandfather, helping with everything from computer problems to home repairs. His construction skills remained sharp, and he enjoyed teaching younger residents basic maintenance techniques. The former board members' attempts to discredit David and challenge his actions had failed completely. Their reputations had been destroyed by their own actions, and their financial difficulties had made them irrelevant to community affairs. They had learned too late that power without accountability inevitably leads to downfall. David's private investigator had uncovered evidence of other questionable practices by the former board, including conflicts of interest in vendor selection and possible misappropriation of HOA funds. This information had been turned over to the appropriate authorities, and while no criminal charges had been filed, the revelations had ensured that none of the former board members would ever again hold positions of community leadership. The new HOA board had implemented transparent financial reporting and had hired an independent auditor to review all transactions. The community's finances were now completely open to resident inspection, and the emphasis had shifted from accumulating cash reserves to providing maximum value for residents' HOA fees. David's foundation had expanded beyond the Memorial Park to support other community improvement initiatives throughout the region. He had partnered with local nonprofits to create programs that helped other communities reform dysfunctional HOAs and establish more democratic governance structures. The success of Willowbrook Estates' transformation had attracted national attention from urban planning experts and community development professionals. David had been invited to testify before congressional committees considering HOA reform legislation, and his recommendations had influenced policy discussions in multiple states. The lake property that had been the key to David's victory over the The HOA had become a model for community-controlled recreational resources. Other neighborhoods had studied the legal structure David had created and had adapted it to their own situations. The concept of resident-controlled but professionally managed common areas had spread throughout the region. David's health had improved dramatically since completing his campaign against the HOA. The stress and anger that had consumed him after Martha's death had been replaced by purposeful activity and community engagement. His doctor had noted significant improvements in his blood, his pressure, and overall physical condition. The memorial bench under Martha's oak tree had become a popular spot for quiet reflection and marriage proposals. Young couples often asked David for permission to use the location for special occasions, and he always agreed, knowing that Martha would have loved seeing her favorite spot associated with new beginnings and lasting love. David's evenings were now filled with community activities rather than lonely grief. He served on multiple committees, attended neighborhood social events, and maintained an active correspondence with other HOA reform advocates around the country. His experience had given him a national platform that he used to help other communities facing similar challenges. The transformation of Willowbrook Estates had taken 3 years to complete, but the changes were permanent and had created a new model for community governance that balanced individual rights with collective responsibility. David had proven that even the most entrenched systems of petty tyranny could be overcome by determination, strategic thinking, and the courage to challenge injustice. As David sat by Martha's memorial bench on the 4th anniversary of her death, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. The HOA that had charged him $500 for grieving his wife no longer existed. In its place was a true community where neighbors supported each other through difficult times and celebrated together during happy occasions. The lake that sparkled before him in the evening light was still beautiful, but it was no longer exclusive. Children from throughout the region learned to fish from its shores while their parents walked the trails Martha had dreamed of but never lived to see. The community garden bloomed with flowers and vegetables tended by hands young and old working together to create something beautiful and nourishing. David's phone buzzed with a message from the current HOA board president asking for his input on the upcoming budget discussions. The message was respectful and collaborative, exactly the opposite of the authoritarian demands he had received from the former board. Smiled and typed back his agreement to attend the meeting where his voice would be one of many working together. For the common good, the sun was setting over the lake, painting the water in the gold and crimson hues that Martha had loved. David closed his eyes, and for a moment he could almost feel her presence beside him, approving of what he had built from their shared tragedy. The community they had dreamed of during their years together had finally become reality, even if she was not there to see it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities. There were other communities seeking his help, other HOAs that needed reform, other neighbors who deserved better than petty tyranny, disguised as community standards. David's work was far from finished, but he had proven that change was possible when people refused to accept injustice. The memorial park was closing for the evening, but David remained on Martha's bench watching the last light fade from the lake. He was no longer the angry, grieving widower who had received that devastating fine 4 years ago. He had become something he never expected, a community leader whose personal tragedy had become a force for positive change that would benefit generations to come. The HOA had charged him $500 to grieve his wife, but in the end, they had paid a much higher price. They had lost their power, their community, and their legacy. In return, David had gained something far more valuable, a transformed neighborhood, where love and compassion governed instead of rules and regulations, where Martha's memory lived on in every flower that bloomed and every neighbor who